Robert Chen had everything most people dream about. At 52 years old, he ran a technology company worth billions of dollars. His penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park in Manhattan, and he had homes in 3 other countries. People recognized him on the street. Business magazines put his face on their covers. He employed thousands of people and made decisions that affected millions more. But none of that mattered anymore. Something was very wrong with his body, and nobody could figure out what. It started small, the way these things usually do. Robert would sit in important meetings and suddenly feel exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. He'd be presenting to investors, people hanging on his every word, and his mind would just go blank. The words he wanted to say would disappear like smoke. At first, he blamed it on stress. Running a company isn't easy, and he'd been pushing himself hard for years. Maybe he just needed a vacation. His assistant suggested he take a week off, fly to his villa in Italy, get some rest. But Robert couldn't do that. There were too many deals in motion, too many things that needed his attention. Then the headaches started. They weren't normal headaches. These felt like someone was squeezing his skull with both hands. They'd come out of nowhere, usually in the afternoon, and last for hours. He'd sit at his desk, trying to focus on reports and emails, but the pain made everything blur together. He started keeping bottles of painkillers in every room of his apartment. His wife, Linda, noticed the changes before anyone else. They'd been married for 23 years, and she could read him like a book. She saw how he'd pause mid-sentence, searching for words that used to come easily. She noticed how he'd forget conversations they'd had just the day before. One morning, she found him standing in their bedroom, fully dressed for work, but just staring at his shoes like he couldn't remember how to tie them. That's when she put her foot down. No more excuses. He was seeing a doctor, and not just any doctor. She called their family physician, Dr. Raymond Park, who had taken care of them for 15 years. Dr. Park cleared his schedule and saw Robert that same afternoon. The examination was thorough. Dr. Park checked everything he could think of. He listened to Robert's heart, checked his blood pressure, looked in his eyes and ears. He asked dozens of questions. How long had the symptoms been going on? Did anything make them better or worse? Was he having trouble sleeping? Any changes in appetite? Robert tried to answer honestly, but even that was hard. His memory had become unreliable. Some days felt sharp and clear. Other days felt like trying to see through fog. Dr. Park ordered blood tests. Not just basic ones, but a full panel checking for everything from vitamin deficiencies to autoimmune diseases. He scheduled Robert for an MRI to look at his brain. He sent him to a neurologist, one of the best in New York. He wanted to rule out everything serious: strokes, tumors, early-onset dementia. The tests took weeks. Robert went from one specialist to another. He spent hours in waiting rooms filled with sick people, something he'd never had to do before. Usually doctors came to him. Now he was just another patient sitting in a paper gown waiting for answers. But the answers never came. Every test came back normal. His blood work was perfect. The MRI showed a healthy brain with no signs of damage. The neurologist put him through cognitive tests, and while Robert struggled with some of them, nothing suggested a serious neurological problem. According to every measure medical science had, Robert Chen was healthy, yet he kept getting worse. The tremors started about 6 weeks after the first symptoms. His hands would shake when he tried to sign documents. He'd be holding a coffee cup and it would rattle against the saucer. During video calls with his board of directors, he'd keep his hands under the desk so nobody would see them trembling. He started missing work. Robert Chen, who hadn't taken a sick day in 10 years, who prided himself on being the first one in the office and the last to leave, started calling in. Some mornings he simply couldn't get out of bed. The fatigue was overwhelming, like his body weighed 1,000 pounds. His executive team tried to cover for him. They'd take meetings on his behalf, make decisions they thought he'd approve. But people noticed. Investors started asking questions. Where was Robert? Was something wrong with the company? Stock prices began to dip. Linda watched her husband fade away bit by bit. The man she'd married was sharp, energetic, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Now he struggled to follow simple conversations. He'd get angry over small things, snapping at her in ways he never had before. Then he'd apologize, confused by his own behavior, saying he didn't know what was wrong with him. She took him back to Dr. Park. They tried different approaches. Maybe it was depression. They prescribed antidepressants. Maybe it was his thyroid. They adjusted his medications. Maybe it was sleep apnea. They did a sleep study. Nothing helped. Robert's children flew in from college, worried about their father. They'd video chat with him every week, but seeing him in person shocked them. He looked older, tired. The spark that had always defined him was gone. His daughter tried to joke with him like she always did, but he just stared at her blankly, like he didn't understand the humor. The business world started to speculate. Rumors flew. Some said Robert was seriously ill and hiding it. Others whispered about drug problems or a mental breakdown. His competitors circled like sharks, sensing weakness. 2 board members quietly suggested he step down temporarily, let someone else run things until he recovered. That suggestion hit Robert hard. The company was his life's work. He'd built it from nothing, working 18-hour days in a tiny apartment, surviving on instant noodles and coffee. Now people wanted to take it away from him because of some mystery illness nobody could diagnose. He became desperate. He saw alternative medicine practitioners. He tried special diets, cutting out gluten, then dairy, then everything processed. He took handfuls of supplements. He tried acupuncture, meditation, yoga. Nothing made any difference. 3 months after the symptoms began, Robert was a shadow of himself. He spent most of his time in his home office, too tired to go anywhere else. He'd sit at his custom-built desk, surrounded by awards and photos of happier times, trying to work but mostly just existing. The walls of his office felt like a prison, but also like the only place where he could hide from the world. What Robert didn't know was that those office walls were slowly killing him. And the person who would save his life wasn't any of his expensive doctors or specialists. She was someone he barely noticed, someone who cleaned his apartment and emptied his trash. Someone who paid attention to details that everyone else missed. Rosa Mendez arrived at Robert Chen's penthouse every morning at 7 o'clock sharp. She'd been cleaning his home for 3 years now, and in that time, she'd developed a routine that was almost like a dance. She knew exactly how long each task took, which rooms needed the most attention, and how Mr. Chen liked things arranged. Rosa was 38 years old and had been cleaning houses since she was 19. She'd immigrated from the Philippines 15 years ago, leaving behind her parents and 2 younger brothers to find better opportunities. The money she sent home every month helped pay for her brother's education and her parents' medical bills. This job with the Chen family paid better than any she'd had before. Most people in Rosa's position were invisible. She understood that. Rich people didn't really see their housekeepers. They'd walk right past her in the hallway without making eye contact. They'd have phone conversations in front of her like she wasn't even there. Sometimes they'd leave money or jewelry out, not even thinking that she might be tempted. It wasn't meanness exactly. They just lived in a different world. But Rosa saw everything. That was part of her job. She noticed when Mrs. Chen seemed sad. She saw when the kids came home late and tried to sneak in. She knew Mr. Chen's habits better than he probably knew them himself. She knew he liked his coffee at exactly 185 degrees. She knew he arranged his pens in a specific order on his desk. She knew he always hung his jacket on the left side of the closet. So when Mr. Chen started getting sick, Rosa noticed immediately. It was subtle at first. She'd find him sitting in his office with his head in his hands. Coffee cups would sit on his desk, cold and untouched. Papers that were usually neatly filed would be scattered everywhere. Some mornings, she'd arrive to find him already awake, still wearing yesterday's clothes like he'd never gone to bed. Rosa didn't say anything. It wasn't her place. But she worried. In her culture, you took care of people. You paid attention. You noticed when something was wrong. Even if that person was just your employer, she started paying closer attention to his condition. She'd clean the bathroom and notice the medicine cabinet was filling up with pill bottles. She'd empty the trash in his office and see tissues stained with blood from nosebleeds. She'd vacuum the bedroom and hear him on the phone with doctors, his voice frustrated and scared. The whole household was changing. Mrs. Chen seemed stressed all the time. She'd snap at Rosa over small things, then apologize immediately. The kids called more often, their voices worried on the answering machine. Important-looking people in expensive suits would show up for meetings, and Rosa could hear them through the door, their voices low and serious. But what Rosa noticed most was how Mr. Chen's condition seemed to follow a pattern. This was something nobody else seemed to see. probably because nobody else was there as much as she was. On mornings after Mr. Chen slept in the guest bedroom, he seemed better. Not good, but better. He'd move around more easily. His voice would sound clearer. He'd actually eat the breakfast his wife made for him. But by afternoon, especially if he'd been working in his office, he'd deteriorate. The tremors would get worse. He'd look pale and exhausted. More than once, Rosa had heard him stumble, catching himself on furniture. She started tracking it in her mind, though she didn't quite realize she was doing it at first. Tuesday, he worked in the office all morning. By lunch, he could barely stand. Wednesday, he took meetings in the living room. He seemed tired, but not as bad. Thursday, back in the office for a conference call. Afterward, she found him slumped over his desk. There was something else, too. A smell. Rosa had a good nose. She'd learned to identify problems by smell. Mildew in a bathroom. Gas leaks. Food going bad in a refrigerator. In Mr. Chen's office, there was a musty odor that seemed to come and go. Some days it was strong. Other days she barely noticed it. She tried cleaning everything in that office more thoroughly. She wiped down all the surfaces with disinfectant. She vacuumed behind furniture. She even climbed on a stepladder to dust the top of the bookshelf. But the smell always came back, especially on humid days. Rosa wanted to say something, but to whom? And what would she even say? She imagined walking up to Mrs. Chen and explaining her theory. Mrs. Chen would probably think she was crazy. Mr. Chen had been to the best doctors in New York. They'd run every test imaginable. Who was she to suggest something they'd all missed? Besides, Rosa had learned early in her career to keep her mouth shut. She'd worked for a family once where she'd mentioned noticing the teenage daughter's boyfriend sneaking out early in the morning. The mother had been furious not at the daughter but at Rosa. How dare she spy on the family? How dare she spread gossip? Rosa had been fired on the spot, so she stayed quiet and watched. She did her job perfectly, the way she always had. She kept the apartment spotless. She did the laundry, organized the closets, stocked the refrigerator. She was polite and professional, and she worried. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday in October. Rosa was cleaning the hallway when she heard a crash from Mr. Chen's office. Then silence. Her heart jumped. She knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. She knew she shouldn't enter without permission. Mr. Chen valued his privacy, especially in his office. But something felt wrong. She opened the door. Mr. Chen was on the floor. He'd fallen from his desk chair and was lying on his side, conscious but dazed. His eyes were open, but he looked confused, like he didn't know where he was. The musty smell in the room was stronger than Rosa had ever noticed before. She ran to him, kneeling down. "Mr. Chen? Can you hear me? Should I call an ambulance?" He shook his head slowly. No ambulance. "Just help me up." Rosa helped him back into his chair. He was shaking, his skin pale and clammy. She got him a glass of water, which he drank in small sips. They sat there in silence for a few minutes while he recovered. "This keeps happening," he finally said, his voice quiet. Rosa wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. "The doctors can't find anything wrong, but I feel like I'm dying." Rosa's heart broke a little. Here was this powerful man, someone who made decisions that affected thousands of people, and he was lost and scared. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire. He was just a sick person who needed help. "Mr. Chen," she said carefully, "I notice you feel worse when you're in this room. Have you noticed that?" He looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in 3 years. "What do you mean?" Rosa took a breath. This could cost her her job, but she had to say it. "You seem better in the mornings, especially when you sleep in the guest room. But when you spend time in here, you get worse. And there's a smell in this room. I've tried to clean it, but it won't go away." Mr. Chen frowned. He looked around his office like he was seeing it for the first time. "A smell?" "Yes, sir. It's musty, like old water or something. It's stronger near your desk and that bookshelf." He sat quietly for a moment, thinking. Rosa could almost see his mind working despite how sick he was. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you, Rosa. I'll mention it to my doctor." Rosa left the office, her hands shaking. She'd done it. She'd spoken up. Now she just had to wait and see what happened. Would he take her seriously? Or would he dismiss her concerns like she'd feared? She went back to her cleaning, but her mind kept returning to that office. To the smell. To the pattern she'd noticed. Something in that room was making Mr. Chen sick. She was sure of it now. But proving it, getting someone to listen to a housekeeper when teams of fancy doctors had found nothing, that was going to be the hard part. That evening, as Rosa was getting ready to leave, Mrs. Chen stopped her in the hallway. Rosa's stomach dropped. This was it. She was going to be fired for overstepping, but Mrs. Chen's expression wasn't angry. It was desperate. "Rosa, Robert told me what you said about his office. About the pattern you noticed. Is there anything else? Anything at all that might help?" Rosa thought carefully. "The smell is worse on rainy days, and I've noticed water stains on the ceiling in that corner, near the bookshelf. Very faint, but they're there. I thought maybe it was just discoloration, but now I'm not sure." Mrs. Chen grabbed Rosa's hand. "Thank you. Thank you for paying attention. For caring." Rosa went home that night feeling hopeful for the first time in months. Maybe someone would actually listen. Maybe her observations would help. She'd spent years being invisible, and now suddenly what she'd seen mattered. It felt strange and terrifying and wonderful all at once. The next morning, Rosa arrived at the penthouse to find it buzzing with unusual activity. Mrs. Chen was on the phone in the living room, her voice tense and urgent. Mr. Chen's assistant, a sharp woman named Patricia, who usually barely acknowledged Rosa's existence, was pacing in the hallway making her own calls. Rosa went about her work quietly, but her ears were tuned to every conversation. She heard fragments of phone calls, environmental testing, water damage specialists, urgent appointments. Her heart beat a little faster. They were taking her seriously. By mid-morning, a man in a polo shirt with a company logo arrived carrying equipment that looked complicated and expensive. Patricia introduced him as an environmental inspector. He nodded politely at Rosa and went straight to Mr. Chen's office. Rosa continued cleaning other parts of the apartment, but she couldn't help glancing toward that office every few minutes. The inspector was in there for over an hour. She could hear him moving furniture, tapping on walls and talking into a recording device. When he finally emerged, his expression was serious. He spoke with Mrs. Chen in low tones. Rosa couldn't hear everything, but she caught words like moisture, possible contamination, and further testing. The inspector said he'd need to take samples and send them to a lab. Results would take a few days. Those few days felt like forever. Rosa kept doing her job, but now she was hyper-aware of that office. Mr. Chen had moved his work to the dining room table, which was inconvenient, but necessary. Rosa noticed he seemed slightly better already, just from that one change. The tremors were still there, but not as severe. He could focus on conversations a bit longer. This observation strengthened her conviction. Whatever was in that office was definitely affecting him. On the third day after the inspector's visit, Rosa was dusting the living room when Dr. Park arrived with another man she didn't recognize. They went straight into the office with the inspector, who had returned with his results. The door closed behind them. Rosa tried not to hover, but she found reasons to clean nearby. She reorganized the hallway closet. She watered the plants outside the office door. She polished the mirror that hung across from it. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door opened. The inspector's face was grim. Dr. Park looked shocked. The third man, who Rosa now realized was some kind of specialist, was shaking his head in disbelief. "We need to seal this room immediately," the specialist said. "Nobody should enter without proper protective equipment." Rosa's hands froze on her dust cloth. Protective equipment? What had they found? Mrs. Chen appeared from the bedroom, her face pale. "What is it? What's wrong with the office?" The specialist pulled out a tablet and showed her photos that Rosa couldn't see from her position. Behind these wall panels, there's extensive black mold growth. It's also in the ventilation system, so, based on the water stains your housekeeper mentioned, there's been a slow leak from the terrace above for months, maybe longer. The moisture has been trapped behind the walls, creating perfect conditions for mold to thrive. "Mold?" Mrs. Chen's voice cracked. "Mold is making him this sick?" Dr. Park stepped forward. "Not just any mold. This particular type, Stachybotrys chartarum, is highly toxic. When disturbed, it releases spores into the air. Long-term exposure can cause everything your husband has been experiencing. The neurological symptoms, the respiratory issues, the immune system problems. It all fits." Rosa felt her knees go weak. She'd been cleaning that room for 3 years. She'd been breathing that air. Why wasn't she sick? As if reading her mind, the specialist turned to her. You're the housekeeper? Rosa nodded, her throat tight. How often are you in that office? Every day, but only for about 30 minutes. I clean it and leave. That's probably why you're not as affected. Short exposure periods, and you're probably not in there when it's at its worst. The mold releases more spores when it's disturbed by air conditioning or heating systems. Mr. Chen was spending 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours a day in there, breathing concentrated levels of mycotoxins. The specialist explained more, using terms Rosa didn't fully understand. Something about the mold being hidden behind the expensive Italian wood panels Mr. Chen had installed 2 years ago. The panels had sealed in moisture from a crack in the terrace waterproofing above. Behind that beautiful wood, the walls had been slowly rotting, growing toxic mold that pumped poison into the air every time the ventilation system kicked on. The testing shows extremely high levels. The specialist continued. This is one of the worst cases of indoor mold toxicity I've seen in a residential space. If he'd continued working in there, the health effects could have become permanent or worse. Mrs. Chen sank into a chair. All this time, all those doctors, all those tests, and it was the room itself. Dr. Park looked troubled. We should have considered environmental factors earlier. But his symptoms were so varied, and everything else we tested for came back negative. We were looking for rare diseases and missing something that was right in front of us. Rosa stood there, still holding her dust cloth, processing everything. She'd known something was wrong with that room. She'd felt it somehow, even if she couldn't name it. Her observations, the ones she'd been afraid to share, had been right. Over the next few days, the penthouse transformed into something like a construction zone. The office was sealed off with heavy plastic sheets and warning signs. A remediation company came in with people wearing hazmat suits and respirators. They carefully removed the contaminated materials, treating them like hazardous waste. The work took weeks. They had to tear out the wall panels, strip away the drywall behind them, remove contaminated insulation, and clean the ventilation system. The terrace above was repaired to fix the leak. Every surface was treated with special solutions to kill any remaining mold spores. During this time, Mr. Chen began treatment with a doctor who specialized in mold toxicity. The treatment wasn't quick or simple. His body had absorbed months of poison. Removing it would take time. But within days of staying out of that office, he started to improve. The brain fog began to lift. He could follow conversations again without losing his train of thought. The tremors in his hands became less frequent. His energy started returning slowly but surely. He began sleeping through the night instead of waking up gasping for air. Rosa watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. She didn't expect recognition. She'd done what felt right. Speaking up when she noticed something wrong, that was enough. But Mr. Chen surprised her. One morning, about 2 weeks after the discovery, he called Rosa into the living room. He was sitting on the couch looking more like his old self than he had in months. Mrs. Chen was there too, along with Patricia. "Please sit down, Rosa," Mr. Chen said, gesturing to a chair. Rosa sat nervously, her hands clasped in her lap. Had she done something wrong? Were they upset about the disruption to the household? "Rosa," Mr. Chen began, his voice steady and clear. "Dr. Park tells me that if we'd caught this even a month later, the damage to my nervous system might have been irreversible. I could have ended up permanently disabled. Or worse." He paused, and Rosa saw his eyes were wet. "You saved my life. You noticed something that teams of highly paid doctors missed. You paid attention when you didn't have to. You spoke up when it must have been frightening to do so." "I just noticed patterns, sir," Rosa said quietly. "It's part of paying attention." "It's more than that," Mrs. Chen added. "You were here every day and you cared enough to see what was happening." "Most people wouldn't have said anything," Mr. Chen nodded. "I've spent 3 years walking past you in the hallway without really seeing you. Without understanding that you knew more about what was happening in my own home than I did. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry." Rosa felt tears forming in her eyes. In 15 years of cleaning houses, nobody had ever apologized to her for anything. "I want to do something for you," Mr. Chen continued. "Not just a bonus, though you'll certainly get that. I want to know what would make a real difference in your life." Rosa thought about her brothers back home. One wanted to be an engineer. The other dreamed of becoming a teacher. Both were smart, but college was expensive. She thought about her parents getting older, needing better health care. She thought about her own dreams, pushed aside years ago when she decided to come to America and send money home instead. "My brothers," she said softly. They want to go to university, but we can't afford it. And I've always wanted to study nursing, but there's never been time or money." Mr. Chen smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Then that's what we'll do. Your brother's education fully paid. And yours too. We'll work around your schedule if you want to keep working, or we'll support you full-time through school if you prefer." Rosa couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears running down her face. Mrs. Chen came over and hugged her, something that had never happened before. But more than the money or the opportunity, what moved Rosa most was being seen. After years of being invisible, of being someone people looked past, she was being recognized as someone whose observations mattered. Someone whose attention and care had value. The story didn't end there, though. Mr. Chen's gratitude ran deeper than just helping Rosa. What happened next would surprise everyone. 3 months after the mold discovery, Mr. Chen was back at work full-time. His health had improved dramatically, though his doctors said it would take a full year for his body to completely recover from the toxin exposure. The experience had changed him in ways that went beyond the physical. He thought about Rosa constantly. Not just about how she'd saved his life, but about what that said about his entire way of living. He'd built a company worth billions by claiming to value innovation and out-of-the-box thinking. But he'd almost died because he hadn't listened to someone outside his usual circle of experts. One evening, sitting in his newly renovated office with its clean air and safe walls, an idea began forming in his mind. He called Patricia into the room. "I want to start a foundation," he told her. "Something focused on recognizing and elevating voices that usually go unheard." Patricia pulled out her tablet, ready to take notes. She was used to Mr. Chen's ideas. "What kind of voices?" "People like Rosa, domestic workers, custodians, security guards, people who see things others miss because they're actually paying attention, people who have insights but no platform to share them." Over the next few weeks, Mr. Chen developed the idea further. He brought in advisors and started having conversations with organizations that worked with domestic workers. He learned things that shocked him. He learned that there were over 2 million domestic workers in the United States alone, most of them women, many of them immigrants. They worked in homes, seeing intimate details of people's lives, yet they were often invisible. Many earned poverty wages despite working for wealthy families. They had few legal protections and little job security. He learned about housekeepers who noticed early signs of dementia in elderly clients and helped families get help. About nannies who spotted developmental delays in children and encouraged parents to seek evaluation. About home health aides who caught medication errors that doctors had missed. So much valuable observation and care rarely acknowledged. This bothered Mr. Chen deeply. He'd spent his career developing technology to solve problems, but he'd missed human solutions right in front of him. The foundation took shape slowly. Mr. Chen wanted to do it right, not just throw money at the problem. He hired people from domestic worker organizations to help design the programs. He insisted that domestic workers themselves have leadership roles. If the foundation was meant to elevate their voices, they needed to be the ones speaking. Rosa became involved, though she was hesitant at first. She was still adjusting to her new life. Mr. Chen had been true to his word. Her brothers were now enrolled in university back home, their tuition paid in full. Her parents had better health insurance, and Rosa herself was taking nursing classes at a community college, studying in the evenings while continuing to work part-time. Mr. Chen asked her to be on the foundation's advisory board. "I need your perspective," he told her. "You understand what this work is actually like." Rosa attended her first board meeting feeling completely out of place. She sat in a conference room with lawyers, nonprofit directors, and business executives. Everyone had fancy titles and impressive credentials. She was just Rosa, a housekeeper who was learning to be a nurse. But when they started discussing the foundation's programs, Rosa realized something. These accomplished people, despite their good intentions, were making assumptions about what domestic workers needed. They were talking about workers, not with them. Rosa raised her hand nervously. "May I say something?" Everyone turned to look at her. Mr. Chen smiled encouragingly. "Of course. That's why you're here." "You're talking about training programs and certifications," Rosa said carefully. "Those are good. But what many domestic workers need first is basic protection. Written contracts so employers can't change terms on a whim. clear expectations about hours and duties, the ability to refuse dangerous working conditions without losing their jobs. She thought about a friend of hers, another housekeeper who'd been asked to clean up after a bedbug infestation, without any protective equipment. When she'd expressed concern, she'd been fired. She thought about another friend who worked 12-hour days for a family that paid her for 8. Who could she complain to? If she spoke up, she'd lose the job she desperately needed. Training is important, Rosa continued, her confidence growing. But first we need to establish that this work has dignity. That the people who do it deserve respect and basic rights. The room was quiet. Then one of the nonprofit directors nodded thoughtfully. She's absolutely right. We were jumping ahead to solutions without addressing fundamental issues. The Foundation's mission shifted based on that conversation. Yes, they would provide educational opportunities and professional development, but they would also advocate for domestic worker rights, provide legal support for workers facing exploitation, and create a certification program that set standards for fair treatment. Mr. Chen watched Rosa speak at that meeting and felt something shift in his understanding of leadership. Real insight didn't always come from the people with the most credentials. Sometimes it came from the people with the most direct experience. He started applying this lesson to his company, too. He began holding listening sessions with employees at all levels, not just senior management. He talked to security guards, cafeteria workers, custodial staff. He asked them what they observed, what problems they saw, what ideas they had. The results surprised his executive team. A security guard noticed a pattern in after-hours badge access that helped them identify a significant data breach before it became catastrophic. A cafeteria worker had ideas about reducing food waste that saved the company thousands of dollars. A custodian noticed that trash from one department contained an unusual amount of printed confidential documents, leading to a discovery that their secure disposal procedures weren't being followed. All these observations had always been there. People had seen these things, but nobody had asked them, and they'd assumed nobody cared about their input. The Foundation launched 6 months after the mold incident. The announcement got significant media coverage, partly because of Mr. Chen's profile, but also because the mission struck a chord. Stories poured in from around the country about domestic workers who'd made a difference, whose observations had mattered. There was Teresa, a nanny in Boston, who'd noticed that a child she cared for was drinking excessive amounts of water and urinating frequently. She suggested to the parents that they have him tested for diabetes. Her observation led to an early diagnosis that prevented serious complications. There was James, a home health aide in Chicago, who'd realized that his elderly client's confusion wasn't dementia, but a reaction to mixing medications incorrectly. He'd organized her pills and tracked her symptoms, information that helped her doctor adjust her treatment. There was Lily, a housekeeper in Los Angeles who'd smelled gas in a home before the family did. Her warning helped them discover a dangerous leak and evacuate before anyone was hurt. These stories weren't unique. They were happening all the time, everywhere. But usually they passed without recognition. The Foundation wanted to change that. One of the Foundation's first programs was a scholarship fund, not just for domestic workers themselves, but for their children. Rosa thought of this often as she studied for her nursing exams. Education could change everything. It opened doors that seemed permanently locked. The Foundation also created an online platform where domestic workers could share knowledge and support each other. Tips on dealing with difficult situations, advice on negotiating fair wages, recommendations for dealing with health and safety concerns. The platform grew quickly, becoming a community of people who understood each other's experiences. But perhaps the most impactful program was the one that provided legal advocacy. The Foundation partnered with law schools and legal aid organizations to offer free legal support to domestic workers facing exploitation or abuse. They helped workers recover stolen wages, fight wrongful termination, and report dangerous working conditions. Rosa became the face of many of these initiatives. She spoke at events sharing her story. It never got easier standing in front of crowds talking about herself. But she did it because she understood that her story represented millions of other stories. Stories of people who worked hard, paid attention, and deserved to be seen. 1 year after the mold discovery, the Foundation held its first annual gala. The event honored domestic workers who'd made extraordinary contributions to the families they worked for. Rosa helped select the honorees, reading through hundreds of nominations that made her cry. There was an elderly man who'd been a butler for 50 years and had basically raised 3 generations of the same family. There was a woman who'd donated her kidney to the child she'd nannied for 10 years. There was a house manager who'd noticed signs of domestic abuse and had quietly helped the victim escape to safety. At the gala, Mr. Chen gave a speech. He talked about his experience, about how close he'd come to dying, about how a housekeeper had saved his life by simply paying attention and having the courage to speak up. We live in a world that often values credentials over wisdom, degrees over experience, titles over character, he said. Rosa had none of the credentials that my doctors had. But she had something they didn't. She was there every day paying attention. She saw patterns they missed because she took the time to really look. He paused, looking out at the audience of donors, workers, and advocates. This foundation exists because I learned that everyone's observations have value. Everyone's voice matters. The question isn't whether people have important things to say. The question is whether we're willing to listen. Rosa sat in the audience wearing a dress Mrs. Chen had helped her pick out, feeling overwhelmed by how much her life had changed. A year ago, she'd been invisible. Now she was being recognized as someone whose voice mattered. But more importantly, thousands of other domestic workers were also being heard. Their experiences valued, their insights respected. The story could have ended there, with the foundation launched and Rosa's life transformed. But there was one more chapter to come, one that would bring everything full circle in a way nobody expected. 2 years after Rosa first spoke up about the smell in Mr. Chen's office, she graduated from nursing school. The ceremony was held at a community college in Queens. Nothing fancy, but to Rosa it felt like the most important day of her life. She walked across that stage in her cap and gown receiving her degree, and heard her name announced over the speakers. Her parents had flown in from the Philippines for the occasion, their first trip to America. They sat in the audience crying tears of joy. The Chen family was there too, Mr. and Mrs. Chen, their children, even Patricia. They all stood and cheered when Rosa's name was called. After the ceremony, as families gathered outside for photos, Rosa's father pulled her aside. He was a small man, weathered by years of farm work, and he spoke very little English. But his eyes said everything. "You did this," he said in Tagalog. "Not just for yourself. For all of us. For your brothers. You changed everything." Rosa hugged him tight, remembering the 19-year-old girl she'd been when she left home. That girl had been scared and uncertain, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and big dreams. She'd spent years cleaning other people's homes, sending money back, always putting her own dreams on hold. She'd made herself invisible because that's what the job seemed to require. But she'd learned something important along the way. Being humble didn't mean making yourself small. Paying attention to others didn't mean ignoring your own voice. And sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply speak up when you noticed something wrong. Rosa's first job as a nurse was at a community health clinic that served mostly immigrant families. The pay wasn't great, nothing like what she could have earned at a private hospital. But this felt right. These were her people. She understood their fears, their struggles, their reluctance to speak up when something felt wrong. She was good at her job, maybe because of all those years of observation. She noticed things other nurses missed. A patient's slight wince that indicated pain they were trying to hide. A mother's worried glance at her child that suggested she knew more than she was saying. The tiny details that told the real story. One day, about 6 months into her nursing job, Rosa was examining a young boy who'd come in with his mother. The mother said he had a persistent cough. The clinic doctor had prescribed antibiotics, but Rosa noticed something. The boy's breathing sounded wheezy, especially when he took deep breaths. His mother mentioned he seemed worse at night. Rosa asked more questions. How long had this been going on? Did anything make it better or worse? What did their home look like? The mother hesitated, then admitted they lived in a basement apartment. It was cheap, the only place they could afford, but it was damp. There was a musty smell sometimes. Rosa felt her heart skip. That sounded familiar. She asked permission to visit their home to see the conditions. The mother agreed, grateful that someone was taking such interest. The basement apartment was exactly what Rosa feared. Peeling wallpaper, water stains on the ceiling, that distinctive musty odor she'd learned to recognize. She took photos and measurements. She contacted the foundation, which connected the family with environmental testing services. The results showed mold, not as severe as what had been in Mr. Chen's office, but enough to affect a child's developing lungs. The foundation helped the family break their lease legally and find safer housing. They also reported the landlord, whose building had multiple code violations. Rosa saved that boy from years of respiratory problems. And she'd done it because she recognized the signs. Because she'd learned that environmental factors could cause mysterious symptoms. Because she'd experienced firsthand how something invisible could make people sick. This became her specialty. Rosa became known as the nurse who always asked about home environments, who understood that health problems didn't exist in isolation, who saw connections between where people lived and how they felt. She trained other healthcare providers to ask these questions too. The foundation noticed her work. They asked her to develop a training program for healthcare providers about environmental health risks, particularly in low-income housing. Rosa created a curriculum based on her experiences, teaching doctors and nurses to think beyond typical diagnoses. Mr. Chen's company also evolved. He'd restructured the entire organization to value input from all levels. He'd established an innovation program where any employee, regardless of position, could submit ideas directly to leadership. Some of the company's best innovations in those 2 years came from unexpected sources. The custodian who suggested a more efficient server cooling system. The receptionist who noticed a pattern in customer complaints that led to a major product redesign. The cafeteria manager who proposed a wellness program that reduced employee sick days by 30%. The company culture changed. People felt valued. They paid attention because they knew their observations mattered. Productivity increased. Employee retention improved, and the company's reputation grew, not just for its products, but for how it treated people. Other companies noticed. Mr. Chen started getting invited to speak at business conferences about his leadership philosophy. He always told Rosa's story. He always emphasized that the lesson wasn't about him being generous or enlightened. The lesson was about recognizing that everyone sees something valuable from their unique perspective. We nearly missed it, he'd say in these speeches. I had the best doctors money could buy and they couldn't solve my problem. But someone who cleaned my home, someone I barely acknowledged, saw what everyone else missed. That should humble all of us who think we have all the answers. The foundation grew beyond anyone's initial expectations. Within 2 years, it operated in 15 cities, serving thousands of domestic workers. It had helped pass legislation in 3 states protecting domestic worker rights. It had provided scholarships to over 500 workers and their children. It had recovered millions of dollars in stolen wages through legal advocacy. But the impact went beyond numbers. The foundation had started a conversation about invisible labor and unheard voices. Other organizations formed, inspired by the model. Companies began implementing similar programs. The whole ecosystem around domestic work began to shift. Rosa served on the foundation's board, balancing it with her nursing work and her own continuing education. She was studying for a bachelor's degree now, thinking about becoming a nurse practitioner eventually. Why not? If she'd learned anything, it was that dreams deferred weren't dreams denied. On the 2nd anniversary of the foundation's launch, there was another gala. This one was bigger than the first, with more sponsors and more attention. Rosa was asked to give the keynote speech. She stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, some of them domestic workers like she'd been, others wealthy donors and business leaders. 2 years ago, she began, I was afraid to speak up. I'd noticed something wrong, something that was making my employer sick, but I didn't think anyone would listen to me. Why would they? I was just the housekeeper. She paused, letting that sink in. But I spoke up anyway. And that decision didn't just save one man's life. It changed my life. It changed my family's life. And it started something that's changing thousands of lives. She talked about what she'd learned, about how everyone has valuable knowledge from their own experience, about how diversity of perspective makes us stronger, about how the people closest to a problem often see the solution most clearly. The world tells us that some voices matter more than others, Rosa continued. That people with degrees and titles have more to contribute than people who clean homes or care for children or prepare food. But that's not true. Every person who pays attention, who cares, who notices when something's wrong, they have something important to offer. She looked at Mr. Chen, sitting in the front row with his family. He was healthy now, fully recovered, running his company and his foundation with the energy of someone who'd been given a second chance. Mr. Chen almost died because people thought he'd surrounded himself with the right experts, Rosa said. But he was missing something crucial. He was missing the perspective of someone who was there every day, paying attention with fresh eyes. He was missing my perspective, she smiled. Not because I'm special, but because I was paying attention. And that's something we all can do, regardless of our job title or education or bank account. We can all pay attention. We can all speak up when we notice something wrong. We can all make a difference. The audience stood and applauded. Rosa felt tears on her cheeks, but she wasn't embarrassed. She'd earned these tears. They represented every hard year, every sacrifice, every moment she'd felt invisible, and pushed through anyway. After the speech, people crowded around her. Other domestic workers thanked her for giving them a voice. Healthcare providers asked about her environmental health training. Business leaders wanted to know how they could implement similar programs in their companies. But the moment that meant the most came later, as the gala was winding down. A young woman approached Rosa nervously. She was wearing a server's uniform, clearly working the event. "Excuse me, Ms. Mendez," the woman said quietly. "I just wanted to thank you. I'm a housekeeper, too. I'm studying accounting at night school. Your story made me believe I could do it, that my dreams aren't foolish." Rosa took the young woman's hands in hers. "What's your name?" "Carmen." "Carmen, your dreams aren't foolish. You're not foolish. You're brave and hardworking, and you deserve every good thing. Don't ever let anyone make you feel invisible." The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes, and walked away. Rosa watched her go, remembering her younger self. How many Carmens were out there working hard, dreaming big, just needing someone to tell them they mattered. That night back in her small apartment, Rosa sat on her couch thinking about everything that had happened. From that first day, she'd noticed something wrong in Mr. Chen's office to this moment, 2 years later, where she was a nurse, a board member, a public speaker, where her brothers were in university and her parents had good health care, where she was helping other people avoid the toxic exposures that had nearly killed her employer. It had all started with paying attention, with caring enough to notice, with being brave enough to speak up even when she was afraid. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mr. Chen. "Beautiful speech tonight. Thank you for everything you continue to do. You didn't just save my life. You taught me how to live it better." Rosa smiled and typed back, "Thank you for listening." That's all any of us really need. Someone willing to listen. She thought about that as she got ready for bed. In a world that often felt divided between those with power and those without, between those whose voices carried weight and those who were ignored, the solution was actually simple. People needed to pay attention to each other. Really pay attention. Not just to those who looked like them or had similar backgrounds or held impressive titles. To everyone. Because you never knew where wisdom would come from. You never knew whose observation might be the one that mattered. The housekeeper who noticed the pattern. The security guard who saw the anomaly. The receptionist who heard the complaint that everyone else dismissed. Everyone had something valuable to offer if only someone would listen. Rosa turned off the light, thinking about tomorrow. She had a shift at the clinic, where she'd see patients and ask about their home environments. Then she had class in the evening, continuing her own education. And next week, she'd visit a school to talk to students about healthcare careers, showing them that paths to success weren't always straight lines. She'd come so far from that nervous girl who cleaned houses and sent money home, but in a way she was still doing the same thing. She was still paying attention, still noticing what others missed, still speaking up when something felt wrong. Only now people were listening, and that made all the difference.